Hey, what is up, guys? Welcome back to another Java tutorial. In this video, we're going to be covering a concept um, called exception handling. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, exception handling is essentially handling certain errors, or as we call them, exceptions, that can potentially crash your app, but they can also come in a form where they don't crash the app and they just cause something not to happen. They stop execution from there and just move on to the next thing. This is a little bit different than logical errors. They don't logical errors and syntax errors don't necessarily throw an exception. Logic errors just mean, oh, I got something wrong here, and I got an unexpected result. And then a syntax error is just something that when you run it, it won't even execute. It'll just go and say, hey, you've got an error here. In a dialog box when you try to run it, and that kind of thing. But if you're running it in the command line, it'll just print out a stack trace telling you, hey, you have a syntax error. So, anyway. So, with that being said, how do we handle exceptions? Well, we use what's called a try, catch, and finally block. In some cases, you don't need the finally. In other cases, you do. So, in order to understand a try catch, we have to first understand exceptions. Now, for exceptions, each exception has a base class. All exceptions will inherit from the same class. Ultimately, it's called exception. So exception defines what a basic generic exception is, and then each individual exception builds off of that. Some build off of the first child and just keeps going. Others will just directly inherit from exception and basically give those exceptions their own individual special functionality. Like, for example, file not found exception or null pointer exception. You may have encountered a null pointer exception if you've done something wrong, got a null unexpectedly somewhere, right? So that's a thing. File not found exception, I'm sure you haven't come across yet, but we will cover it in the next upcoming videos, because in the upcoming tutorials after this, we're going to be covering files and how to read, write from them, how to copy files, all that kinds of stuff, all the kind of input-output operations that you would need to do with files in Java. And in those tutorials, we're going to cover both how you used to do certain things and the new way of doing things since Java 8. But that's out of the scope of this particular tutorial right now. So, anyway, back to our exceptions. When you're dealing with something like null pointer exception, for example, that will come up when something in your program is null and you don't know, your code doesn't tell you that, you don't have any squiggly lines saying this may not have been initialized or whatever, because you initialized it somewhere else, and when you try to initialize it using retrieved data, it still comes back null, and then you try to use it, and your app will potentially crash and say, hey, we found something that was null, here's a null pointer exception, and a bunch of gobbledygook inside of the red text, which is called a stack trace. Other times, for example, when you're working with files, to go back to that example, the file not found exception, as the name implies, gets thrown when a file path, when a file at a certain path cannot be found, or when a certain path to a folder can't be found, or anything like that. Basically, if a file or folder cannot be found at a specific path that you give it, it will throw that exception. And so that's kind of important to note. With exception being the base class for all exceptions, it is possible for you, the programmer, to create your own exceptions. Often when I'm working with databases, specifically MySQL or SQLite or something, I will create an exception that I myself will throw if a database action cannot be performed. So if something goes wrong when I'm trying to access the database, insert something into the database, update something, whatever, that exception will get thrown, and I'll know, oh, something went wrong when I tried to work with the database somewhere. So that's a thing. That's kind of a rundown of exceptions and the things you can do with it. So, how exactly do we go about? How do we go about utilizing exceptions? For example, in methods that we do ourselves, right? So, let's say we want to create a method where we want to get the user's name. This is just purely an example. And if it's null, we want to notify the user, hey, this cannot be null in any way, shape, or form, right? So, how do we do that? Well, we need to create a method that will throw an exception at some point. How do we do that? Well, we can go public static void, because we will be using it inside of our public static void main, so it kind of has to have static when we use it in that particular area. We're going to say get user's name, or rather get name of user. That makes a little bit more sense. And then after the parentheses, we say throws, and then we'll just say exception to be generic. We could say null pointer exception. We could say file not found exception. We could say any kind of exception that we want to throw, but we're just going to go generic. We're going to go with a generic error here, because we don't. Because in some cases you're not going to know what exception you want to throw right away. So we'll do that, and here we are. And we'll ask the user for a name for the string name, right? So then we'll say if name is not equal to null, we don't want to throw the exception. Otherwise, we want to throw the exception, or we want to throw a new exception, right? And then we'll just say system out print line name if it isn't null. Now, this is just a very basic example of how you would go about doing it. typically there's much more advanced ways. For example, when you're accessing a database, you'll want to make sure that it actually executed properly and that kind of stuff. If it didn't, you want to catch that exception, throw it before something gets mutated that you don't want to get mutated, or your application crashes or something like that. Anyway, so with that being said, we can now go ahead and we'll try to call this method without a try catch, and you'll see why you can't do that. Get name of user, and we'll pass it null. Right? So when you try to do that, we get a red underline. Why do we get a red underline? Well, if we hover over it, you can see it's basically telling us that we have an unhandled exception type exception. So it's basically saying that, hey, this could potentially throw an exception. You need to handle this. There are many exceptions. There are many methods within certain classes that will throw certain exceptions. When you're dealing with files, this is no surprise. So, what exactly do we do here then? Well, we need to create our try-catch blocks. Now, in this video, we're not going to we're going to show the finally, but it's not necessary in this case. So, let's go ahead and construct this, right? So, try, opening and closing, not parentheses, curly brackets. Then we want to have catch. And then this inside of the parentheses can be as generic or specific as you want. Like I mentioned earlier, you can chain catch blocks if you want to catch specific errors and handle them specific ways, rather than one generic way. Otherwise, you can just put exception and just be generic if you want to handle all exceptions the same way. And I'll name exception EX. And then we'll have our finally block, which the finally block will execute all the time. There no exceptions, pun entirely intended. There's no exception to that rule. The finally block will always execute. Right? So, let's go ahead then. And we'll go get name of user, and we'll pass it null. Now, this is obviously going to throw our error, because it goes and says, oh, if this is null, we want to throw an error. Or an exception, I should say. What do we want to do? Well, let's say, how we want to do this is we want to say, we'll print out system.out.println, and we'll say, sorry, this name, or the name you provided isn't a valid name. Please try again. In fact, if we really want to, what we can do is we can say system.error.println, and this will basically print it out in our red text that you usually see with the stack traces. And after we print this line, we also want to print our stack trace that we receive. How do we do that? Well, you would go EX as the name of the object, if it's just E, if it's exception, whatever you named it, dot, and then call the print stack trace method. that will print the stack trace to the screen. And now let's go to the finally block, and we'll say system out print line the finally block has been reached. Cool. So once that's done, we can go ahead and hit the run button. And you can see we get our error message of, sorry, that name, the name you entered, the name you provided isn't a valid name. Please try again. And then we get our stack trace. And then we get the finally block has been reached. But what happens if we then give it a valid name? Right? So we'll say, Johnny. Right? So let's provide it a name of Johnny. Now, name is no longer null. We go ahead and save that. And we run it. You can see Johnny gets printed out. And then everything in our catch block, where we print out an error message and then we print out the stack trace, that all gets skipped over because no exception was caught. There was no exception that happened. So it just went straight down to the finally block and it was done. So that's the basics of how you catch exceptions, and how methods that you can create to throw an exception if you need to works, how you do that. And yeah, so with that being said, prepare for a little bit more complicated stuff from here on out. Because in the next tutorial, we are going to start working with files. And this working with files stuff is super important, and you will be doing it more often than you think. Whether it be working with JSON data, or trying to parse XML, or whatever it may be, you're going to be working with files while you do it. So that basically does it for this tutorial, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. See ya.